You're probably aware that you have a variety of explicit attitudes. If I asked whether or not you like elderly people, for example, you probably could give me an answer, and you would probably believe it to be a truthful answer. But did you know that you also have implicit attitudes, ones that you're not consciously aware of, and that these implicit attitudes may or may not agree with the explicit ones? Not only have psychologists found evidence that implicit attitudes exist, but they have even developed a clever way to measure them. Let's find out just how easily these scientists can learn your implicit attitudes about a range of controversial subjects, attitudes that you yourself don't even know you have.
Do you have a preference for white people or black? How about for the young or the elderly? If you ask people if they have a preference, say for the young, you may find...
No, not at all.
Probably.
No, not really. No.
But the attitudes we express may tell only part of the story. On a test called the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, you can learn whether you have an unconscious or implicit attitude that differs from the attitude you're aware of. Harvard University psychologist Mahzarin Banaji studies the relationship between the attitudes we report and our implicit, unconscious attitudes. Explicit and implicit attitudes don't always differ, just sometimes.
I might report having a feeling of a certain kind. I might say, I really like X. But the implicit attitude need not always fit with that. In other words, it's something that resides a little bit below the surface of conscious awareness.
Along with colleagues Brian Nosek and Tony Greenwald, Banaji developed the IAT. And several million people have visited a website where they can anonymously try one of the over 60 tests. Here's how it works. There are questions about your conscious attitude, and then there's the unconscious part. On the race IAT, the computer rapidly presents black and white faces and good and bad words. You have to respond quickly. The computer compares the speed with which you associate good or bad words with white faces with the speed of associating good or bad words with black faces. And in just 10 minutes, you get results. You just may not like them.
I'm pretty shocked, to tell you the truth.
Most white Americans report a neutral attitude towards the groups white and black. But that's not what they show on the implicit association test. The majority of white Americans, close to 80%, show a pro-white bias. What this raises then for us is the question of which of these attitudes is the real one. And I think the important point here is that both are real.
The extent of bias shown by whites on the race IAT varies widely, but it might predict real-world behavior. A high negative bias might influence a white employer who's considering hiring an African American.
And as a result, perhaps come to the conclusion that this is not somebody that we wish to hire.
As for data on African Americans, they report very favorable conscious feelings about their own group. But on the IAT,
that about half the African American subjects are showing a pro-white bias and the other half show a pro-black bias. Those data are troubling.
And it may reflect how much African Americans are affected unconsciously by the negative ways in which our culture portrays them. What do critics say about the IAT?
Is the IAT measuring anything other than just a simple association? Why do you think it's measuring an attitude at all?
To answer this, Banaji has looked for biological variables that might correlate with IAT scores. Brain scans of white subjects have been performed using magnetic resonance imaging. During the MRI, subjects first see what appears to be just a brief flash of light.
But behind that flash is a face, and we believe that the face is being detected at some level that is outside the person's conscious awareness.
But a part of the brain associated with emotional learning, the amygdala, responds.
In this brain scan for white subjects, what you see in this orange area, which is the amygdala, is greater activity when one sees black faces rather than white faces. The higher activation in the amygdala to black rather than white faces tells us that it is detecting a black face to be a more threatening stimulus than a white face.
And the amygdala's response correlates with IAT scores.
What you see here for white subjects is that the greater their race bias as measured by the IAT, the greater is the activity in the amygdala as well. When we show that these two measures overlap in the way in which they do, it begins to tell us that maybe they're tapping the same kind of things. We would argue that the activation in the amygdala is a good measure of what the implicit attitude might be.
But when white subjects in the scanner see black and white faces for longer time periods, the amygdala becomes less active. The prefrontal cortex, or PFC, which is involved in emotion regulation, takes over. And this helps us to have a less biased, overt response. And what is being learned from the age IAT?
That it shows the largest bias of any we've seen.
People do show more positive conscious attitudes towards the elderly as they themselves age, but
whether you are age 8 or age 80, you seem to show the same negative implicit attitude towards the elderly.
Given that explicit and implicit attitudes can differ, people now have an opportunity to ask themselves what they wish to do.
Tools like these now make it possible for us to confront a part of ourselves that was not otherwise visible.
And Banaji says if we choose to, we can use such awareness to de-bias ourselves. First, research shows that implicit attitudes can be modified.
Changing the environment can change implicit attitudes.
So changing the frequently biased media reports about minorities into unbiased ones might affect implicit attitudes. And second, although we can't literally force our implicit attitudes to change,
there is that we can change our conscious attitudes. We know we have control over them. And as we begin to show that conscious attitudes do have impact on the unconscious ones, that's another way to go. What I now need to do is to be especially vigilant of what I can control, and in so doing, perhaps affect the implicit as well.
The IAT is particularly good at predicting people's nonverbal responses to the target group, such as eye contact and smiling. Nonverbal behaviors tend to be spontaneous and automatic, so it's probably not too surprising that these behaviors are associated with implicit attitudes. If you think for a moment about what other things can be done below the level of conscious awareness, such as forming impressions of people's friendliness or trustworthiness, it's clear that implicit attitudes are important to study and understand.